Do you want to know how moving a documentary Ezra Edelman, the Academy Award-winning documentarian, has made about Prince for Netflix? Questlove, after attending a screening of this documentary in the summer of 2023, says that he then, after seeing this film, spoke with his therapist until 3 o'clock in the morning and cried so hard he couldn't see. That was the emotional impact that Academy Award-winning director Ezra Edelman's documentary about Prince for Netflix had on Questlove. And we're likely to never come anywhere near as close to this film, moving though it apparently is, as Questlove did. And that's because the Prince estate won't let us. And they won't let us because they don't want the truth about Prince to come out. Now, is there some ugly truth in this documentary about Prince? Evidently, by the reporting seen in the New York Times a week ago, yeah. But generally, the truth about Prince is that in many ways, Prince was just like the rest of us. He was this contradictory guy who did his best with the circumstances that life threw at him. And sometimes he handled those circumstances in ways that were profoundly regrettable. Does that sound familiar? Is that you? Is that me? Yep. Yeah, it is. So help me understand exactly what is this? Yes, again, there are some very ugly details in this documentary about Prince, but generally, the truth about Prince is he was profoundly flawed. Who watching this video isn't? I am, Lord knows. Right? I mean, good grief. And so, what it comes down to when you read this New York Times story, and we're about to take together, you and me, a deep dive into this brilliant, breathtakingly well-written story by Sasha Weiss in the New York Times Magazine that came out a week ago about the cluster that has become this ongoing saga as we speak surrounding Ezra Edelman's 9-hour-long documentary for Netflix that has been shelved because the Prince estate won't let it come out. We're going to take a deep dive into this piece because it helps illuminate a couple of really important things. A, what exactly are the details that the Prince estate claimed were, quote, factually inaccurate or sensationalized? What truly was in that film? What is the substance of? Remember, when I made my last two videos about this documentary, we were grasping at straws as to what exactly the details might be that compelled the Prince estate to say this is a factually inaccurate film written with factual inaccuracies and it's sensationalized. And at that time, you saw the Hollywood Reporter, you saw other publications going to the Prince estate and saying, "What? What's factually inaccurate?" And no one knew at the time. Now we at least know. Now we've put some substance, thanks to this brilliant piece by Weiss for the New York Times Magazine, exactly what the points are, what are the revelations the documentary makes that ruffle the feathers of the Prince estate. And what we also know, in addition to the specific details that the Prince estate does not want to see the light of day, ultimately, really, the Prince estate's refusal to allow this Netflix documentary about Prince by Ezra Edelman, 9 hours long, and we're about to get into the sweat and tears and blood that Ezra Edelman poured into the making of this film over a almost 5-year period. What does it boil down to? Ultimately, what else? Money. It's really just about money. And that's where the Prince estate's concern principally lies. And again, as I said on my last video about this Prince documentary situation, for the Prince estate to come out and level charges of factual inaccuracy against this director, when really the truth is there were some ugly things about Prince. He did some ugly stuff that some of his fans who aren't aware of it are going to find shocking and objectionable. This hero's going to get pulled back down to earth in the eyes of some of these fans, okay? They're claiming that this is factually inaccurate when, in fact, it's just who Prince was. These are some of the things that he did that, God forbid, prohibit him from being canonized by the Vatican as a saint, which especially in the United States, especially in our puerile culture here in America, We insist on whitewashing, just glossing over the ugly parts of these heroes' stories, these brilliant artistic geniuses who they're not allowed to just be geniuses. When we're going to present them in the form of a biopic or a documentary, we just kind of walk on eggshells around the grittier parts, because we just need them tidily processed in this rigidly framed narrative that portrays them in a false light through the rose lens glasses that the estates of these dead artists, like Prince, like Amy Winehouse and others, insist as the only way that the public can consume the legacies of these brilliant artists. And Prince is the latest and possibly the most tragic example of that tendency. Okay, and so they level these accusations of factual inaccuracies at an Academy Award-winning director, when in fact it's really just about money. They don't want these ugly things coming out about Prince. They're afraid he's going to get canceled as a result, and then their cash cow won't be bringing in the dough. The Prince estate won't be raking it in, to the extent that maybe, who knows how much money the Prince estate makes these days. But their concern is, well, if we let it known that he punched Jill Jones in the face, we let it known that he abandoned his wife after their baby died, we let people know about his insistence that one of his bandmates renounce her homosexuality if she wanted to get back in the band. This is all reported in the New York Times. I'm not making this up. I'm not pulling this out of thin air, okay? Yeah, there are some disturbing things about Prince. But if we let these things out, Prince is going to get canceled. We're not going to make any money. And so what we're going to do is accuse the director of lying. How irresponsible and unethical is that? I'm more convinced of that being the case now after reading the New York Times story than I even was when I first made this case in my last couple of videos about this documentary. And if I'm Ezra Edelman, again, I'm spitting mad about it. I want to preface this by saying I'm nowhere near the artist that an Academy Award-winning documentarian is. But I have written 2 books. I've had a lot of poems published in a lot of literary journals. My master's degree is in creative writing with a concentration in poetry. So yes, I am an artist, okay? And if I am, as I've done, if I am in a manner that is as loaded with integrity as I can summon, if I'm just honestly engaging with my art simply for the purpose of mining the truth out of whatever subject I'm engaging with, as Ezra Edelman, it seems clearer now more than ever, try to do with his subject in Prince. And after I bring that out into the world, I've got people with vested interests protecting financial self-interest, accusing me of not having brought integrity to my own work. I would be pretty outraged. And this is why you see this emotion come out of me when I try and fathom this from the perspective of Ezra Edelman, okay? Let's take a deep dive into this, again, brilliant and breathtakingly well-written story by Sasha Weiss for the New York Times Magazine about the saga that, unfortunately, tragically, this Prince documentary has become. She is described by the New York Times Magazine as, quote, one of a small number of people to have seen the Prince film. So she's seen this documentary. This is, the people making comments on my videos about this documentary who are alleging that Ezra Edelman sought merely to dig up sleaze and shovel a bunch of sleaze or sabotage or slander or savage Prince or whatever. They haven't seen the film. And so I'm not sure how one can level any accusations as to the substance of the film itself if you haven't actually seen it. What I'm able to do now is base my assertions about the film on Sasha Weiss's reporting as to its actual contents as someone who watched the film. And that's why it's so important for this follow-up video to be put out there, because we know so much more about what the reasons why this Netflix 9-hour-long Prince documentary by Ezra Edelman is tragically going to be shelved, is shelved as we speak, and may stay that way. So she's seen the film. She reported out this story over a period of 1.5 years. She interviewed more than 20 people, the New York Times Magazine says. Well, she calls this documentary, quote, a cursed masterpiece. This is a deputy editor of the New York Times Magazine who has seen the film calling it a masterpiece. She says further of the film that, quote, the film shows more movingly and convincingly than almost anything I've seen how life can illuminate art. And yet, how separate the two things really are. The bruises and mess of experience are transfigured by the artist into something coherent and whole, a perfect offering. These are her emotional impressions of the film. This is her intellectual assessment of the film's substance. This is her witnessing its impact on her as she viewed it. Okay. Now, one of the big concerns about this documentary all along, and the other sort of phony way in which the Prince estate has come up with to justify its refusal to allow this documentary to go forward by withholding rights to Prince's music, which need to be used in the film about Prince, obviously, right? One of their phony arguments is, well, we only agreed to a 6-hour-long documentary. Ezra Edelman made it 9 hours long. That's a violation of the agreement, violation of the contract. Okay? Well, guess what? Fortunately, because Sasha Weiss is a sterling journalist, talked to multiple people who also saw the documentary and specifically asked them for their perspective on the length of the film. Was it too long for you? Was 9 hours too much? And again and again and again. In fact, the length of the film specifically is a reason why these people thought it was masterful. So here again, the Prince estate is exposed by, now most recently by this New York Times story, to be barking up the wrong tree here with this claim that it's too long. Weiss says of the film's length, having seen the documentary in its current form, all I can say is that its length is part of its majesty and fundamental to the claim Edelman is making about Prince's importance. Does this sound like the work of a guy who was just shoveling sleaze and trying to sensationalize or savage Prince? The Prince estate, I think in some of the comments of theirs that I've seen, or other defenders of the estate's position on this, have been out in the press saying he sensationalized, by he I mean Ezra Edelman, Prince's life. Does this... Again, I'll read you Weiss's take. Having seen the documentary in its current form, all I can say is that its length is part of its majesty and fundamental to the claim Edelman is making about Prince's importance. What would he care about Prince's importance if his project, by some strange circumstance, as an Academy Award winner, is merely to agree to do a documentary for Netflix, still the premier platform on which people consume streamed content these days, especially documentaries like this? His project would be merely to take this on just to slander the guy, just to dig sleaze up or whatever? Why on earth would he do that? He spent 5 years of his life just for that purpose? Think. Come on. Now, that's just Weiss's take. She talked with a novelist named Danzy Senna, who is a friend of Ezra Edelman's and also saw the film. And Danzy said of its 9-hour length, the bigness of it. Now listen carefully, because this is important stuff here. Black genius doesn't get that treatment. What a moving sentence that is. We would treat Mozart this way. And this is the kind of mind we're dealing with. Very unusual, once in a century kind of brilliance. He's talking about Prince's genius, and I agree. Prince was a once in a century kind of brilliant. Absolutely. And so does a film, again, in which Ezra Edelman merely is seeking to slander or savage or sensationalize, impact someone that way? Does Prince's importance come to the fore in a project merely with the purpose of digging up sleaze on the guy? Weiss also spoke with the director of the wonderful documentary that you've almost certainly seen, Hoop Dreams. Remember that one? What was that, 94 or so? Came out a while back. I was a youngin' back then, but I saw it in theaters, and I found it to be unforgettable. Great documentary. Well, Steve James, the director of that film, also has seen this Prince documentary, and here's what he says specifically about its length. As a viewer, you are asked to grapple in the same way the filmmaker does, with all the complexity of who this guy was. The good, the bad, and the ugly. God forbid. You mean he wasn't all good? He wasn't the same person every waking minute of his life? What? He had complexity to him like all of us do? Whew! Wow! What? Who knew, right? That's the integrity of the filmmaker and the completeness of it, Steve James says. Now listen to this. You know that what you are watching is indisputable. Now Steve James, director of Hoop Dreams, is saying this. Guy's directed plenty of stuff besides that. This is a veteran filmmaker, very experienced, a master of the craft that Ezra Edelman is practicing in making this Prince documentary. himself saying that he knew as he was watching all 9 hours of this documentary that what he was watching was, quote, indisputable. Weiss acknowledges, by the way, Edelman's own greatness as a filmmaker in this piece. They say of Edelman, his last film, O.J. Made in America, won the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 2017 and is widely regarded as one of the most ambitious documentaries ever made. Well, what did the Prince Estate exactly expect then when this, and I've gone over the reasons why the O.J. Simpson documentary was every bit as ambitious as Weiss claims. You watch my prior two videos. I'll link to them in the description here. I'm not going to rehash all of that here. There's plenty of other stuff to get into today. But go ahead and take a look at those other videos, if only to just get a sense of the ambition, the craftsmanship, the devotion, and the passion and the intensity that Edelman brings to his projects, as he undoubtedly did with the O.J. Simpson Made in America film, which won an Academy Award and an Emmy, a primetime Emmy. It still stands, I believe, as the only documentary to win both, because it blurred those boundaries between television and feature film. I discuss all of that in my prior two videos on this documentary. But when we get into the Prince Estate's charges that Edelman somehow, despite the sterling reputation that Weiss acknowledges, and that clearly others sense who watched this film about Prince, the reason the Prince Estate levels these claims of factual inaccuracies is it was the only excuse on which they could justify refusing to allow it to go forward. We now know that thanks to Weiss, who says this, quote, Prince's estate, which at the time was being administered by a bank in Minnesota, the state of Prince's birth, of course, would have no editorial influence over the project, Edelman was told. Okay. Edelman and Netflix would retain final cut, though, listen closely, the estate could review the film for factual accuracy. Edelman decided to sign on, despite reservations that he himself had about signing on to this project, which we'll get into. The estate could review the film for factual accuracy. Now, hear me out as a journalist myself. I edit a magazine for a living. I have for a decade. I've worked in journalism for about 2 decades now. Okay? I've written stories for the New York Times. I have experience in this realm, and I'm telling you, when you have someone who you're writing about say, hey, would you mind showing me this story before it goes to print? Your answer categorically is no, right? When it has happened on rare occasion, when I've had to take that step on behalf of a subject I've written about, okay? The excuse you give as the journalist always is, well, okay, I'll let you see it, but only for you to clarify any factual inaccuracies. And that's how you create the parameters within which this person about whom a piece is written is going to give you any feedback whatsoever. In the very rare instance in which you almost never should do, any journalism school 101 class will teach you this. But if it happens, that's how the language proceeds between the people creating the whatever it is, a film, a story, whatever, and the subject of that content. It's always hinged on concerns about factual accuracy, right? Because what journalist, what filmmaker doesn't want to make sure that whatever they're creating is not 100% factually accurate? And so the Prince Estate took that and ran a mile with it and said, oh, factual inaccuracies. BS. They just knew that was the only justification they were going to have for doing what they've done, which is forcing this documentary to be shelved. This documentary that left Questlove in tears so intense he couldn't see. This documentary that left Questlove in conversation with his therapist until 3 o'clock in the morning after attending the screening. Okay, ridden with factual inaccuracies. Now shelved. The world can't see it. Really because of motives driven by self-interest and money. Now, thanks to the New York Times, we also know many deeply fascinating revelations that Edelman's film makes about Prince. Some of them are illuminating of the man's character. Others are profoundly disturbing, as I've already alluded to. But let's get into some of the revelations here, because there's so much that Weiss reveals. Thank goodness that she saw the film and that she has a platform like the New York Times in which to report on what she saw. One of the most fascinating revelations that the film makes, and one that in and of itself generated plenty of press in the last week since this New York Times piece came out, was a story about this utterly mind-blowing guitar solo that Prince performs when he's inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2004. You've seen it, right? Because more than 29 million other people have watched it on YouTube. He comes on stage while all these sort of withering, aging white rock stars are performing a version, including George Harrison's son Danny, of While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And Prince comes out and lights it on fire with it defies language's capacity to describe accurately the brilliance of this guitar solo, which since that moment has been part of the lore of rock and roll. And it turns out that the motive behind this guitar solo was that Prince, idiotically, was left off of the 2003 Rolling Stone magazine list of 100 best guitarists of all time. Now, if you're familiar with anything I've done at The Curious Listener, you might know that the first video I ever uploaded to The Curious Listener was about the more recent 250 top guitarists of all time that Rolling Stone put out, that list. When they did this in 2003, Neil Young was 17th on the list. Stephen Stills was 33rd. Lindsey Buckingham was 100th, right? Even you know, if you've watched that video that I did about why Rick Beato was wrong about Neil Young, and the context of that whole rant of mine was the Rolling Stone magazine's list of 250 top guitarists of all time. So you know I'm a huge Neil Young fan watching that video. Even I am not going to say that Neil Young is a superior guitarist to Prince. The fact that he was 17th on that list in 2003 and Prince wasn't even included on the list is enough of a testament to the idiocy of such lists in general for you to realize that what you do with those lists is some emotion such as this, like crumpling it up in a nice little ball and tossing it in the nearest waste bin that you can find, because that's what they're worth. Those are inane. And Prince was right to be pissed. And what the New York Times says about Prince's response to that is as follows. Quote, Prince nursed these kinds of slights with his commandeering of the stage at an event associated with Jan Wenner, the Rolling Stone magazine founder, and Rolling Stone, was in part an act of revenge. There's spite and aggression in the performance, but there's also pain in his wincing face, his apartness, a small black man on stage with these rumpled white rockers. And it's in the next paragraph of the story in which Edelman's treatment of this single episode in Prince's career makes clear that his documentary is a masterpiece indeed. Just listen to the genius with which Edelman uses this one scene from Prince's life as a performer to capture the entirety of Prince's psychological being. It reads as follows, quote, Edelman juxtaposes the first moments of the solo with wisps of the past, calling back to earlier images. Here's Prince jumping up again to be seen behind his peers. Here's Prince as a baby being held by his mother, and we hear his voice saying, quote, I ran away when I was 12. In fact, she kicked him out of the house when he was 12. We know from the sequence before this one that his parents had recently died at the time that he came out on stage in 2004 and rolled out this stunning guitar solo. Suddenly, this triumphant performance is given this other dimension of insecurity and insistence in the face of all doubters, the white rock establishment, his uncomprehending parents, the demons in his head. The keening he elicits from the guitar is so plaintive you want to weep too. A close friend of his later told me, Weiss is saying, that Prince himself would watch this performance over and over, as again, nearly 30 million others also have done. This documentary, according to Weiss's reporting, again, Weiss being one of the few people who's actually seen the documentary, which is being shelved at the insistence of the Prince estate, violence was a feature in Prince's childhood home. His sister Tika Nelson, who, by the way, is his only full sibling, whom Weiss beautifully describes as a woman with owlish eyes and pink and purple streaks in her hair, appears on screen at this point in the documentary. She describes the violence in their household growing up, how their musician father's face, Prince's dad, changed when he hit their mother. And that's the disgusting violence that Prince was witness to growing up, okay? The ire he directed at his son, on whom he bestowed his former stage name, Prince, a gift but also a burden, a reminder that the demands of supporting his children had caused him to abandon his own musical career. Prince would risk lashings by sneaking over to the piano and plinking away at it. The son already embarked on his life's work of besting his father, the father giving and withdrawing love, the son doing the same. Beautiful writing that also just as beautifully establishes some of the psychological trauma and drama that played out as the backdrop to so much of Prince's creative output over the course of the decades-long career he enjoyed. You had some real trauma for Prince, as I just alluded to, but in a different way. Listen to this. Apparently, I didn't know this. Prince's stepfather had at one point locked him in the bathroom for 6 weeks, passing food through the door, and when Prince emerged, his ebullience was gone, wife reports. One source says he went inside himself. He changed. 6 weeks in solitary in the bathroom of your house at the insistence of your stepdad, who's feeding you like a dog by passing food under the door or whatever. Prince's mom kicks him out of the house when he's 12, as I just alluded to. He then goes to his dad. Remember? The dad who gives and then withdraws love? The dad who resents Prince because Prince was born and his dad apparently had to give up whatever musical ambitions he had to be a family man. Goes to his dad, whom Prince idolized as a musician. But dad was a Seventh-day Adventist who kicked Prince out after discovering him in his room with girls too many times for his liking, and his sister Tika reportedly says in the documentary that, quote, broke his heart. Prince's dad also would take credit for Prince's genius. He would claim he should have songwriting credit for some of his songs. He would claim that basically everything Prince accomplished was because of the talents that he either learned from or inherited from dad. Just awful. The absence of the kind of validation that any child would want from his parents. And for that kind of validation to be absent in the face of such profound accomplishment as that which Prince enjoyed is a form of devastation that I would submit to you few children ever experience. Because few of us get to say that we won Grammy Awards, or that we had feature films out, or we sold many, many, many millions of records, or we became, on par with Mozart in terms of the treatment of our life story by an Academy Award-winning director as Ezra Edelman. And in the face of that magnitude of accomplishment, for your parents to never get it, I can't fathom the pain that must have caused Prince. Any child is desperately seeking validation from parents. Was it Lester Bangs who at one point famously said that the history of rock and roll is one long cry of daddy? There's countless examples of artists for whom that is true. Tom Petty and Madonna and Bono, and you can go on and on, of tremendous artists whose fathers were terribly abusive or indifferent or cold figures in their lives. And Prince, as we hear, certainly was unfortunately a member of that sad lot of rock stars whose dads were a source of tremendous torment for them. I would say that some of Weiss's most profound writing in this New York Times piece occurs when she is grappling with what she understands to be Prince's aloneness. Not loneliness, but just being so solitary, so locked up inside himself. There's a beautiful passage at the very end of the story which describes Prince's death inside an elevator at his property, Paisley Park, and says, look at the manner of his death. Inside this little box of an elevator, inside the little cage of Paisley Park, completely solitary and alone and apart. And she describes his apartness even on stage among those rock stars performing this inferno of a guitar solo. The man's aloneness keeps coming up again and again tragically in this piece. She describes it in part as follows, that Prince fantasized about becoming a loving husband and father, but Prince could not attach. He turned and grew paranoid, and despite the entourages that he assembled and disassembled around himself, he was ultimately terribly alone. She says later in the piece, his pattern was to create closeness that could edge into suffocation and then suddenly turn away. She also says that he was, quote, a motherless, fatherless child who longed to be protected by a family of his own. Childhood grief, Weiss asserts in this piece, surfaces in his song. She makes this wonderful observation about one of the quirks of Prince's delivery as a recording artist. She says Quote, I had always taken Prince's yelps and cries as transgressive, in-your-face sexuality, but watching Edelman's film, I understood that they also carried real grief. Now, here's where we get to some of the most disturbing revelations that surface in Ezra Edelman's film, which undoubtedly was going to examine the ugly and the good, the terrible with the triumphant, because that's his job, is to tell the truth, not to look away from the uglier aspects of it and only tell the truth when it's convenient, especially for the prince's state. I'm sure that was the last concern on his mind, and perhaps they resent that about him. But they should have known better, knowing his reputation as an Academy Award-winning, profoundly ambitious, historically ambitious. I mean, he made history with that O.J. Made in America film. They should have known that Ezra Edelman was going to do his actual job, okay, in making this documentary. And one of the ways in which he does it is he digs up some of the uglier aspects of Prince's life. Now, there's this Jill Jones incident. I'll read at length here about what is said about Jill Jones. This is publicly available information. You can pull the story. I'll link to the story in the description, of course, and read for yourself. Quote, the film at one point cuts to Jill Jones, one in a long line of girlfriend muses whom Prince anointed, styled, encouraged, and criticized. Hers is one of the most anguished testimonies in the film, revealing a side of Prince many of his fans would rather not see. And Edelman, by the way, as we're going to see, was acutely aware of that. Late one night in 1984, she and a friend visited Prince at a hotel. He starts kissing the friend, and in a fit of jealousy, Jones slaps him. She says he then looked at her and said, bitch, this ain't no expletive movie. They tussled, and he began to punch her in the face over and over. She wanted to press charges, but his manager told her it would ruin his career, poor baby. So she backed off. Yet for a time, she still loved him and wanted to be with him and stayed in his orbit for many more years. Recounting the incident 3 decades later, she is still furious, still processing the stress of being involved with Prince. He also is revealed by this documentary to be ruthlessly controlling. Weiss says this about that aspect of his character. He became a domineering band leader, ruthlessly extracting from his musicians the sounds he was hearing in his head, often subjecting them to 10 to 12-hour-long days and growling in their faces about their insufficiencies. Edelman found that the people Prince worked with were still afraid of him, yet in many cases also tenderly protective. That statement in and of itself embodies the contradictions that define Prince. Here are these people who are terrified of the man, but also tenderly love the man, tenderly are protective of him. There are many women in his life who are the same way, as Weiss's reporting makes clear. Listen, you know, Prince was a contradictory character, just like all of us are. And Weiss sort of claws at that reality as follows. Quote, like most Americans who grew up in the 1980s, I had an image of Prince emblazoned in my mind, wonderfully strange, a gender-bending, dreamy master of funk. He flouted and floated above all categories and gave permission to generations of kids to do the same. Edelman's film deepened those impressions while at the same time removing Prince's many veils. Removed the mask that Prince tried to wear. That was Edelman's job. I mean, there's a great W.B. Yeats biography, one of my favorite books really ever, called W.B. Yeats' Behind the Mask, I think it's called. I mean, that's what a biographer's job is. That's what a documentarian's job is, to remove the mask of that subject and see him or her for who he or she really is. Weiss goes on to say, this creature of pure sex and mischief and silky ambiguity I now saw was also dark, vindictive, and sad. This artist who liberated so many could be pathologically controlled and controlling. The film is sometimes uncomfortable to watch. But then always there's relief. The miracle of Prince's music, a release for me, and a release above all for Prince. We're asked to sit with Prince's multiplying paradoxes for many hours, allowing them to unsettle one another. The paradoxes multiply for the vast majority of us as the years accumulate over the course of our lives, don't they? This is what I mean when I say that really whatever truth ultimately it is that the Prince estate doesn't want to come out is pretty mundane. It's just that Prince was in lots of ways, perhaps we could say, tragically ordinary, just as the vast majority of us are. And this is where these commentators accusing Edelman of trying to slander Prince or go to, dig up some sleaze or sensationalize. Weiss makes this statement that I think those folks need to really absorb, which is this: the mode of the film is not to linger in judgment, not to do those things that these critics again, many of whom haven't seen the film and may never see the film. He doesn't linger in judgment. The purpose is to probe, to try to make narrative sense out of the disparateness of Prince's personality, in part by showing how his memory lives in the people who knew him. And there's this guy named Charles Spicer, to the contrary, who is a co-founder of Prince Legacy, the LLC that manages assets from the Prince estate, who criticized the documentary on Twitter with the hashtag no 9-hour hit job. What that I have revealed over the course of this video to this point sounds to you like a hit job? Please tell me. Again, here's a New York Times deputy editor of the New York Times Magazine, who's one of the few people who has seen the documentary. Didn't strike her that way. The many sources she spoke with trying to get honest responses out of them about the film, they didn't see it that way. They actually watched the movie. Edelman, he did his job by exploring this tension between an artist's genius and an artist's moral failings, okay? And Weiss cuts right to the bone on that topic. She says this: Edelman offers one answer to a question that has agonized the culture at large for the last decade. How should we think about artists whose moral failings are exposed? Edelman manages to present a deeply flawed person while still granting him his greatness and his dignity. Well, Nick Cave, the subject of the most recent video I did for the curious listener, he's got this new album out called Wild God that is in and of itself a revelation. Gorgeous, immensely powerful piece of music. 5 years ago, on his, I think he calls this website like Red Hand Files, where he addresses fan questions in a very erudite manner, as Nick Cave is known to do. But in 2019, he himself, as an artist, addressed this question about, well, what do you make of a musical genius who also might have been kind of a crappy person? How do you grapple with that, Nick? And the context in this case was Morrissey, whose far-right political views were troubling some of his longtime fans, okay? Well, Nick Cave addressed this question from a fan, which read as follows. What did he say? Yes, I'm trying to reconcile Morrissey's recently unsavory far-right support to how I used to put him on a pedestal. Well, maybe that was the fans' first problem, putting him on a pedestal. We've all heard the saying, you never want to meet your heroes, right? Because we have them on a pedestal. We worship that image of them on that pedestal in our minds, and if they turn out in actuality to be anything less than that, it can be a shattering experience for us. This fan goes on to say, generally, is it possible to separate the latter-day artist from his earlier art? More specifically, what are your views on Morrissey, both early days and his newer, more ugly persona? To which Nick Cave responds as follows. This is really important. And those who are troubled by the Prince documentary's revelation that Prince had some very ugly aspects to his character and did some very ugly things, while at the same time creating some of the most profoundly impactful and beautiful music of the past half century, might want to listen closely to this, okay? Here's what Nick Cave has to say about the subject. Quote, when I listen to a beloved song, Neil Young's On the Beach, for instance, I feel at my very core that the song is speaking to me and me alone, that I have taken possession of that song exclusively. I feel beyond all rationality that the song has been written with me in mind. As it weaves itself into the fabric of my life, I become its steward, understanding it better than anybody else ever could. I think we all can relate to this feeling of owning a song. This is the singular beauty of music. Perhaps it doesn't matter what Neil's personal conduct may be like, therefore, or Morrissey's, as they have handed over ownership of the songs to their audiences. Their views and behavior are separate issues. Morrissey's political opinion becomes irrelevant. Whatever inanities he may postulate, we cannot overlook the fact that he has written a vast and extraordinary catalog, which has enhanced the lives of his many fans beyond recognition. This is no small thing, Nick goes on to say. He has created original and distinctive works of unparalleled beauty that will long outlast his offending political alliances. Cave adds that as a songwriter and someone who believes songs possess extraordinary healing power, I am saddened by the thought that songs by arguably the greatest lyricist of his generation, which is a hell of a bit of praise coming from Nick Cave, by the way, songs like This Charming Man, Reel Around the Fountain, and Last Night I Dreamed Somebody Loved Me are consigned to the moral dustbin by those who feel they have been tainted by his current political posturing. I respect and understand why people respond this way, but can't help but feel, listen closely, It is of significant personal loss to them, as it will be to all of us, in the event that this Prince documentary is permanently shelved. Lastly, Cave adds this: perhaps it is better to simply let Morrissey have his views, challenge them when and wherever possible, but allow his music to live on, bearing in mind we are all conflicted individuals. This is all I'm trying to say. Right? Messy, flawed, prone to lunacies, in Nick Cave's language. We should thank God that there are some among us that create works of beauty beyond anything most of us can barely imagine, even as some of those same people fall prey to regressive and dangerous belief systems. We as a country, this is me talking now, we need to grow up. I think that's possibly the signal lesson here with respect to this ridiculous absurdity that has become the saga surrounding Ezra Edelman's Prince documentary for Netflix. We need to stop insisting that our musical artists, that we anoint to be our heroes, also be saints. We've got to cut this out. None of us is a saint. Some of us are worse sinners than others. And among those sinners happen to be some musical geniuses, possessing a visionary talent rarely experienced in this world, and Prince may well have been one of those. And if that's the man's story, it was Edelman's job to tell it as such. And it sure sounds like that's exactly what he did here. And listen to the price that Edelman had to pay in telling the story the right way, okay? Edelman's tireless investment in the project is described in the New York Times piece as having broke him, as having been soul shredding. Weiss reports that the film took Edelman almost 5 years to finish, and it nearly broke him. He often worked nights and weekends, chasing down recalcitrant subjects who seemed haunted by their friendships with Prince, researching in Prince's personal archive, which was filled with gaps and elisions. How can you tell the truth about someone who, when you're talking to people, they all had different contradictory things to say? This is Edelman talking now to Weiss. How can you tell the truth about someone who never told the truth about himself? This was Edelman's struggle making this film. Again, does this sound like a guy whose investment in this project was merely for the purpose of slandering the man, of sensationalizing? I just think, at the very least, that strains credulity, that argument at this point, okay? And Weiss further reports that this concern about how to tell the truth about a guy who never told the truth about himself was amplified, quote, when Edelman and his team discovered that Prince's personal archive contained almost nothing that was spontaneous or personal in the vault. Almost no footage of him recording or writing. At one point, they were excited to discover a few home movies of Prince horsing around with girlfriends, but when they watched the tapes, they appeared to have been deliberately damaged. This was the fierceness with which Prince protected his privacy and did not want the world to catch a glimpse of the man behind that mask. Weiss goes on to report also that, as one of the film's two main editors put it, Prince's personal archive was, quote, not all that different from an Instagram account or a Facebook page. It was manicured, curated just the way Prince wanted it. This is what Edelman was up against as the man charged with the task of telling Prince's life story in the form of a documentary for Netflix. Prince described as soul-shredding his experience of trying to create as deep a portrait as he could of someone who spent his life trying to avoid being fully seen. Weiss goes on to say that despite the existence of several biographies and oral histories, there was still not so much about Prince's life that was unknown, and the challenge would be to try to figure out who he really was. This is a man engaged in the struggle of telling the truth about a subject in Prince who spent a lifetime avoiding the truth about who he really was, getting out into the public. And, in part, that may result from his own childhood trauma. Abuses such as he suffered will condition the child's mind to believe that if anyone found out who I really was, clearly that would be a disaster, because I, for a moment here in my childhood, was my authentic self without even thinking twice about it until it was abused out of me and I crawled inside myself. In Prince's case, during the 6-week period that his stepfather locked him in a bathroom, feeding him under the door like a dog, you darn well believe he came to some really unsavory conclusions about his self-worth through that experience and never let go of them, evidently, because look at how guarded he is about the true person that he was. I can't let people see me. because look at how my family treated me when I was 7. I mean, I'm clearly a worthless, despicable, embarrassing screw up. That may have been, listen, yeah, I'm playing armchair psychologist, fine. But that may be part of the underpinnings of this compulsion that Prince apparently had to guard his privacy with a fierceness that almost defies reason. I mean, purposely damaging tapes of him horsing around with his girlfriends, whatever that means. Edelman, as I alluded to earlier, he was aware of the risks in his approach to telling any subject story, okay? He was aware of what a defining figure Prince was for so many fans, Weiss reports, who might not enjoy seeing their hero inspected with the intensity he brings to his projects. And Questlove comes back into the picture here because that was precisely his struggle after attending the screening of this film. He says as follows, quote, "It's a heavy pill to swallow when someone that you put on a pedestal is normal. He's a genius, he's majestical, he's sexual, he's flawed, he's trash, he's divine, he's all those things, and man, wow." That's all Questlove had to say about that. That was the bottom line for him. Weiss says that Prince was both extraordinary and a regular human being who struggled with self-destructiveness and rage, which probably is a sentence that describes many of us, right? We may not all be extraordinary, but we all have our demons and angels lording over us, one on each shoulder, right? And at times one wins out over the other as it pertains to the outcome that is our behavior, right? That's a struggle that basically every one of us faces. Maybe not quite on as grand or intense a scale as a global celebrity like Prince, but I think much of what Weiss says in that quote is familiar to all of us. Okay? Edelman's attempts at truth-telling, however intense those efforts were going to be a tortured and anguished experience because of how guarded Prince was about who he really was. Okay? Edelman understood before the film was finished, by the way, that it might never see the light of day. This is another fascinating aspect of Weiss's reporting here. She says, listen, he's eventually came to see the writing on the wall, that this was going to happen, that he was going to put 5 years of effort, which, by the way, he never stopped investing in the film, right to the bitter last moment. Even as he saw that it was probably a hopeless project trying to get this documentary ever to actually find its way out into the public, he continued ironing out the kinks in the editing process. He continued pouring every last drop of sweat he could summon into this project, even as he came to perhaps be almost certain of its doomed fate. And Weiss about that says the following: Edelman continued to perfect his film, working to capture the essence of Prince even as it became slowly, painfully clear that it would most likely never air. Later on in the story, Weiss reports that even as Edelman and his team continued to work on the film, quote, "the project was being obstructed by the Prince estate." Now, why are we so sure? I mean, we can't be 100% certain. Maybe something changes and somehow some form of the documentary finds its way into the public. I much would prefer that it's its present form. It's full 9 hours. Just what's the point of hiding it at this juncture? We know what's in it. The thousands of words of reporting by Weiss as to the contents of this documentary. What are you what is there left to hide? And now it's truly inane to withhold this documentary from the public, is it not? But some of the reasons why this documentary is unlikely to see the light of day are as follows. There's this point at which the Prince estate changed hands and the new executors objected to this project. The estate quickly moved to shut Edelman and his team out of the vault, which is his personal archive at Paisley Park, with no explanation, making it even more difficult to finish the film. But on top of that, in March of 2023, this happens. Lisa Nishimuro, the Netflix executive who negotiated the original deal and hired Edelman, was laid off after restructuring, a move that shocked the industry and was genuinely thought to signal a change in Netflix's strategy. With Nishimura gone, the project lost its most powerful internal champion. And then this past spring, this year, the Prince estate sees the current cut of the film and claims that it misrepresented Prince, entered into a protracted battle with Netflix, which owns the rights to the film, to prevent its release, which, by the way, entails a significant financial loss for Netflix, because Weiss reports that Netflix merely to secure access to Prince's personal archive, paid tens of millions of dollars. And then the estate changes hands and like, nope, forget that. We're not, stay away. You get your hands out of the vault, sir, Mr. Documentarian or whatever. I don't care how much you paid to get in there. I don't care if it was $1 billion. Get lost. That didn't help, right? Now, Weiss, being the brilliant writer that she is, beautifully sums up this doomed fate of the Netflix Prince documentary as follows, quote, "It has been like watching a monument being swallowed by the sea." Does that sound hopeful to you? And this screening from hell, when he shows it to the Prince estate, the outcome of that is that the Prince estate submits to Netflix a 17-page long document demanding changes to the film. And Adelman at first was like, all right, I mean, I can see where I can compromise a little bit and actually make some initial changes to the film. But Weiss reveals he was adamant that he would not remove episodes or ideas that felt crucial for the film's narrative and journalistic cohesion. Okay? But this is the point in the story by Weiss, when we come to realize that these claims of factual inaccuracy are BS. Because she reports the kinds of changes, in part, that the Prince estate was demanding. Listen to this one, for instance. They wanted him to take out a part of Wendy Melvoin's interview when she talks about Prince calling her up after he became more religious to ask her to renounce her homosexuality as a precondition for getting the band back together. What does that have to do with factual inaccuracy? That's just something about Prince you don't want the world to know, okay? Because then he might get canceled, right? And how are you going to make money off of your cash cow as a Prince estate when that happens? Weiss also reports that the estate told Edelman they believed the film would do generational harm to Prince. Okay, that's when we start to hear that this is about the money, right? Weiss goes on to say, several people I spoke to said they believe McMillan's, now this is Londell McMillan, who's associated with the company that manages assets pertaining to Prince's estate. His objections come down to a fear that the film will get Prince canceled and devalue the estate's bottom line. You think? Jay-Z warned us, by the way. He came out with that album 414 in which he targets Londell McMillan specifically and explicitly in the lyrics of that record. At one point saying the following, "I sat down with Prince eye to eye. He told me his wishes before he died. Now Londell McMillan, he must be colorblind. They only see green from them purple eyes." Now, you think Jay-Z knows a thing or two about who's just in it for the money in the music business? Perhaps he knows a little bit about that. Perhaps Jay-Z has developed an instinct for that kind of thing, for the avarice that characterizes so much about the music and entertainment industries. Perhaps Jay-Z brings a degree of credibility to that perception. Okay? Now, here's an interesting concern that I came across about the film. One that I find to be far more interesting to toss around than these ridiculous claims by the Prince estate of factual inaccuracy. There's a poster on Reddit that Weiss quotes as follows. The documentary tears him down and then builds him up. They only do this to our black heroes. Will they talk about a fight with an ex from 45 years ago when they do Mick Jagger's or David Bowie's documentary? Will they talk about drug use or grooming young women? Of course not. Well, that's an interesting point. And I can tell you, as you yourself can see, if you go back and look at my video about the documentary about Brian Jones, the founder of the Rolling Stones, absolutely, that documentary pulls no punches in its depiction of his womanizing, his predilection for impregnating and abandoning women, which I think he did 5 separate times. It gets deeply into his drug addictions, which ultimately killed him. He's found face down in a pool, dead, at a tragically young age of 27 years old. But on the same token, Moon Age Daydream, the Brett Morgan documentary about David Bowie, I saw it. It might have alluded a bit to his drug use, but I don't know enough about David Bowie's treatment of women except for following Imam, his widow, on Instagram, who seems to this day adore the man, to have any comment on the extent to which Bowie treated women with respect. I can tell you, I don't remember much of anything being said about that in the David Bowie documentary, which was nominated for an Academy Award in and of itself, Moon Age Daydream. I heartily recommend it. I am going to do a video on must-watch music documentaries because Lord knows I spend enough time kicking them around on here on The Curious Listener, right? Now, this further criticism by Danielle Smith, former editor of Vibe magazine, doubles down on this idea that, maybe the way Prince is depicted in this documentary wouldn't be the way a white rock star would be portrayed in a documentary of similar scope and length. And Danielle Smith says this, or Weiss is characterizing Danielle Smith's take on it, and then quotes her a bit. While she would never insist on a purely celebratory portrait of a black icon like Prince, she could understand the feelings of rage and neglect that lie behind that wish. The fact that we rarely see this atomization of Mick Jagger or Bowie, or for that matter, Paul Simon or Paul McCartney, allows, quote, this is her being quoted now, a very traditional white male masculinity to still stand there as a monument of what genius is supposed to look like. She offered a comparison to George Washington, who was allowed to stand as an unquestioned national hero for centuries before anyone focused on how he, quote, stole dentures from his slaves' mouths. So as you can see, the fate of this Prince documentary has tugged on some deep emotional chords here. The bottom line to me seems to be this: you're not going to see this film. You're certainly not going to see it in its present form. And it's a tragic loss for all of us, for this film to fail to escape the censoring hands of the Prince estate. Especially in light of Questlove's response to this film, Sasha Weiss's response to this film, Steve James's response to this film, Danzy Senna's response to the film. It seems quite clear, doesn't it, that the shelving of this documentary is a profound loss for humanity, and results purely from the financial self-interest of a Prince estate that is afraid that the truth will get their cash cow canceled. And if that's where this story ends, shame on them. Shame on them. And it is truly a loss for all of us to be prohibited from getting a full portrait of one of the most fascinating stars to emerge in contemporary pop music for the past half century.